day 4 and the end of week 1 in the Lori Vallow Daybell murder conspiracy trial. Erica, this was one, I mean, it was a day full of testimony.
Oh,
it was compelling.
So compelling. And you started the day with her brother testifying and you think, gosh,
Right.
It can't get more serious than this. And then it did. It very much did. We had, I would say, we had 5 witnesses all in total take a stand, and 3 were just really quite inflammatory, I would say. So there's certainly a ton to talk about today.
So was the courtroom full? We talked yesterday about not as many people there. What about today? Did you have more people there?
Yeah, people must have sensed that something could be coming here. And it was full in the morning. And notably, someone who we haven't seen yet was in the courtroom. It was Colby Ryan, Lori Vallow's surviving son in all of this. He's an adult. He was an adult when this happened. And as you can imagine, this has been a tough relationship with his mom since this all unfolded after losing his siblings and his father figure. And yeah, this was the first time he was in the courtroom, and we were able to chat with him briefly after court. So I look forward to sharing some of his remarks once we get there. Yeah, but absolutely. I know we probably want to start. Yeah, we probably want to start with Adam Cox, Lori's brother. And this is, to make sure people understand, Lori is accused of conspiring to kill her husband, Charles, with her brother, Alex Cox. This is a different brother who, for lack of a better term, was kind of on Team Charles with all of this. And it was really interesting to hear him testify, because if you recall, Andrea, I don't think he ever came out to Idaho. He wasn't really part of that case, even though we knew he was around. We knew that he was, had relations with Charles, but this was totally new testimony for us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it was. I think that it sounds like as soon as this happened, it sounds like he was working with Charles, really trying to support him, and even standing up to his own family, kind of bringing those concerns forward about what seemed to be Lori's kind of deviation from the religious beliefs and the kind of those practices, I guess, that he was comfortable with, that they had been raised with in the LDS church. And so I think he said that his family really kind of didn't want to hear it. Wasn't interested in it. So like you said, he was Team Charles, and he was actually going to be there right before Charles was killed. And to hear him talk about that, wow.
Yeah. Well, and it's sad. It was so sad. And you think about all the circumstances surrounding this case, and it just kind of peeling back another layer. It's like, oh my goodness, so many family members have been impacted by the actions of, a handful of people. And as you said, he and Charles they showed text messages between the two of them. They said, hey, we need to plan, an intervention here. We're going to try and help Lori. That was their intent. So Charles actually bought Adam, a plane ticket. He was supposed to come into Phoenix and stay with his brother, Alex. But when Adam said he landed here, he reached out, didn't hear from Alex. And what's notable is that we know, and what he didn't know at the time, was that Alex was staying at Lori's house. Lori had asked him, according to records, to stay close to her. And he was at Lori's house with a bag of ammunition and a handgun. And Adam never heard from him. And when Charles finally showed up that morning to go take JJ to school, he said, oh, Alex is here. And their text message exchange was they were planning something. And Charles said, absolutely. So they sensed something was off, but I don't think anyone could have imagined that Alex would shoot and kill Charles. And it was really, just striking to hear not only the turmoil kind of leading up to that moment, but also how Adam found out. He said he didn't learn it from anyone in his family. It was a friend a couple of days later. He said, I'm kind of concerned about my brother-in-law. They searched on Google, and all of a sudden that's how he learned what had happened. So it was really quite chilling. And
he's not the only one who we've heard this from. So we heard that yesterday from the woman who had gone out with Charles the night before he was killed. We later heard that from another witness, a couple of witnesses today, where, that is interesting, because you can imagine, you have to put yourself in that position. And as a juror listening to that, that's not normal to have something so traumatic happen in your house. This man is dead. Your brother is involved. Assuming that the defense
to have no one in your family reach out, and for him to be the only one in his family, according to his testimony, to think it's weird was also just really eye-opening. And that wasn't the only weird. I think there's a lot of words we could use to describe what happens next, which is Lori cross-examining her own brother, and we want to give you guys a listen to some of that exchange.
So Mr. Cox, did you see or hear or personally witness me conspire with my brother Alex Cox to murder my husband Charles Vallow?
Repeat that again.
Okay. Did you see with your eyes or hear with your ears or personally witness me conspire with my brother Alex Cox to murder my husband Charles Vallow?
No.
Thank you. No more questions.
You were asked if you personally saw, heard your sister Lori conspire to kill Charles. Were you there that morning?
No.
Were you the person who was supposed to, though, be with Alex on the 10th into the morning of the 11th? You spent the night with him?
If I would have spent the night with him, yes.
So that stood out to you because you had made plans with your brother, right?
Yes.
And instead, you learned he was at Lori's house.
Yes.
When you were talking to your family after this happened, did you actually tell them that you believed that Lori and Alex had conspired to kill Charles?
Yes.
Why was that?
Because Lori had told people that Charles was no longer living, that some guy named Ned was inside of his body, that there was a zombie living inside of him. And Alex didn't respond to any of my text messages when I was supposed to be with him. And he was at that house that morning. Lori talking crazy about how she's a translated being. All these things all added up into that moment and that morning. Once I found out on Saturday that Charles was shot and killed, no doubt in my mind that they killed him.
Andrea,
No doubt
obviously
in my
a lot
mind.
to unpack. Yeah, no doubt in his mind. And that, of course, an exchange between first him and his sister, and then the prosecutor followed up on a lot of those things Lori tried to bring up. But I want to know if you caught something, Andrea. Lori, when she's cross-examining her brother, she calls him Mr. Cox. And I don't know why that just struck me as wild, but and I would imagine that the jury probably is picking up on some of these strange things too. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I caught that, and of course, some sort of. I think that's perhaps just a professionalism. You can't know, is this what I'm supposed to do? But also just the nature of the interaction. It is odd to have this person asking the questions of the witness referring to me, right? We just don't see that because most people don't represent themselves. So this interaction between these siblings, you have to wonder what the jury is thinking about that too. In that it indicates clearly they have been estranged. They don't know that she's been in prison now in Idaho for years and been a part of this process. But it's interesting to see what they take away from that clearly very distant, I guess, interaction. And do they chalk it up to just that's what you do when you're in a trial? Or is there some kind of deeper meaning there? And you have to, I mean, I even wonder if him having her repeat that question, I even thought that was a little bit interesting, and maybe he's just simply wanted to make sure he got it right. But it, almost made me wonder. He took such a long pause and made me think he just wants that back on the record. Wants that very clear on the record.
And I think
wonder.
Yeah, and I think the prosecutor made a very clear point to say, like, you were asked about this, and of course, and we'll see as we go through the rest of the day that question was a theme for Lori Vallow Daybell.
Yes.
That did you see or hear me? And I feel like most people who are involved in these sorts of criminal cases are, of course, not standing next to you in the room if they're, if you're testifying.
Right.
So it's a bit of an unusual question. And I think, trying to get in the mind of Lori here, which is not an easy thing to do at this point, but I would imagine she's just kind of throwing everything she possibly can be throwing at the wall to try and cast doubt. And clearly the prosecutor is paying attention to circle back and say, this is weird, right? Like, what do you really think? Like, you obviously weren't there witnessing it, but like, what do you believe really happened here?
Well, and in her whole entire trial, hers and Chad Daybell's in Idaho was 100% circumstantial evidence. And so, I think that exactly, that that's what she's trying to do. You assume that she is trying to just put that doubt in that, essentially saying you can't know because you weren't there. And yet we also know that juries convict on that kind of evidence without, having eyes on witness. That happens routinely. So how effective that strategy will be, given that that's probably the only one she can use at this point, but how much will that work? How well will that play for jurors? Of course, remains to be seen. But you're right. She asks that question of essentially everyone. That seems to be sort of her closing question. That is the last thing she wants to have people thinking about at that point. That seems to be her
Absolutely.
move.
And, I think we can move on to the next witness, Sarena Sharp. She is, this was also very interesting testimony. And essentially, in a nutshell, we learn that she is someone, and it's a name that's familiar to us because we know she didn't testify in Idaho from my recollection, but we know that Chandler Police interviewed her about this case. That her interview was part of a records request that we got here in Phoenix. And we knew that she was kind of one of these fringe members. And it's interesting to kind of see some of these people that we knew were involved in the case come to the forefront here. And Sarena, just so everyone knows, is someone who met Lori through Preparing a People. That is the group that she was involved with, Chad Daybell, and people, kind of a religious group that focused on the second coming of the Lord. At least that's what the testimony said today. And they met at, a handful of these events, but the biggest parts of her testimony, I think, were about, when the prosecution asked her, what sort of things was Lori saying? And she, the two big takeaways for me was that she felt Lori had said that Charles was possessed and that Lori linked someone being possessed to being a zombie. So those were kind of the two big takeaways. And then, Andrea, we also saw that Lori had an opportunity to cross-examine this witness too. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that before we get to that sound and let people hear it for themselves.
Well, it's certainly interesting because, as you said, they came together because of this like-mindedness. I mean, they were, all together as part of this conference, which to many people that we've talked to as a member of the mainstream LDS church, this group was considered fringe or considered, not a part of what they consider the mainstream church to be. And so already, it's a unique group, it's a smaller group. And yet even her, she said, what she started saying, things just didn't add up and it didn't make sense. She thought that it was concerning, the things that she was talking about. And Lori kind of challenged that, in her testimony. And you could tell I couldn't figure out really what the line of questioning was intended to be. But it was interesting that she kept tying it back to those religious beliefs, which we know is the underlying theme in a lot of this, a lot of these court hearings that we've seen Lori be a part of. That seems to be the motivation. And yet here is somebody who thought a lot like her in the terms of those religious beliefs, saying, no, it didn't make sense. It didn't match what we knew. And I thought that was interesting.
It almost feels like they were in two different realities, which I think has been kind of an accusation of Lori and, throughout this entire process. And it was interesting because it almost felt like, and this was the first time in court, in front of the jury, that we heard Lori speak about religion. And we knew this might be something that was coming. We've heard her speak about this in the very few interviews that she's given. And we also heard about this at her sentencing in Idaho. I think that was really the first time I remember hearing, I believe the judge in that case said she was deep in a religious delusion or something to that effect. And the way she speaks about religion and the way she challenged, as you said, someone who's like-minded, who was part of this group, it was really striking to see. And we want you guys to take a listen.
Ms. Sharp, did you take an oath when you came into this courtroom today?
Yes, I did.
Did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did.
Did you swear to tell the truth?
Yes, I did.
The whole truth?
Yes.
Nothing but the truth?
Yes.
So help you who?
God.
So can we agree that this court acknowledges that your testimony here today will be accountable to God?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the relevance of this.
Sustained.
Your Honor, they brought up the religion.
Ask for a response. It's sustained. Ask the next question.
Do you believe that your testimony here will be accountable to God?
Yes.
So in the instance when you said that I mentioned to you something about zombies, I would like to know what I said to you exactly verbatim about zombies.
Well, I remember we talked about zombies in 2019 for the girls' weekend. You had mentioned zombies.
I mentioned zombies at that weekend out of my mouth, and not someone else, but me.
Object to argumentative.
Overruled. You can ask. Why don't you rephrase that question?
Okay. So you're saying, under oath, that I said the word zombies at that meeting, or I'll go with that.
To the best of my recollection, it was that weekend during the girls' weekend, 2019.
And
Again, that was 6 years ago, so like verbatim, I don't remember verbatim, but I think it was that weekend.
Ms. Sharp, who are the three Nephites in the Book of Mormon?
The three Nephites? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
In 3rd Nephi 28, the three Nephites, do you know who they are?
Off the top of my head, no.
You do not know who they are.
No, not off the top of my head.
Okay. In the Bible, do you know of John the Revelator?
Yes.
Do you know of John the Revelator being translated?
I don't remember that, but
You don't remember that? What about in the Old Testament, Elijah? Was he translated?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to relevance.
What's the relevance?
I've been accused of being out of the scope of the LDS religion when this is exactly in the scope of the LDS religion.
All right. I guess to the extent you're comparing yourself to these biblical figures, I'll allow it.
Wow.
So translated,
Andrea, what do you
let's
think
look-
of the tone? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's explain. So just to give people just a little bit of insight, and I am no expert in this, but what she's trying to say is that I was talking about someone being translated. I was talking about someone not being in their body. So their body essentially being, or their soul or their spirit not being there. And so their body just being a body or taken over by another being. In this case, I think she referred to him as Ned, who she said that had taken over Charles. So I think she's trying to challenge Sarena's opinion that, or statement that this was out of the norm. It didn't fit their religious beliefs by then tying back to these other figures, these other religious figures who were translated, just as she was saying that Charles may have been. And so it's interesting, but I'm not sure that the jury follows that. I think I only know that because of such having followed this case for so long and listened to some of these arguments and some of these statements. I'm not sure that made a whole lot of sense. It seemed even Sarena herself was a little bit confused by, where are we going with this? I'm not really sure what you want
Well, I
from
don't
me.
think it was, I don't think it was just Sarena, because obviously the prosecutor is objecting to this line of questioning, and the judge there too. You could tell, we'll get to the jury in a second, but you can tell that the judge is also losing his patience with the way Lori Vallow Daybell is conducting herself sometimes in court. We saw again, I know this has been an issue, it seems, every day, that she's been commenting after she asks the question. And this came up with this particular witness. She kind of reeled it in and said, sorry, but the state continues to object to a lot of these things. And I think tone is also important here, not just the content that she's, bringing up here during cross-examination, but the way she's asking this is really, it feels very charged. And I'm wondering if you picked up on that and why you think she may be trying that approach, especially with the jury in front of her. Because I think for everyone in the courtroom, everyone in the gallery, I should say, for the lay of the land, the jury is kind of off to our right. The judge is in front of us. Her table's off to my left and the prosecution's off to my right, but everyone else is sitting back and the media is in the very back row. So we can kind of see everything. And when she's saying these things and asking these questions, there are people aghast in the gallery. There are
Yeah.
people, they're like just jaw-dropping moments. And a lot of the people in the gallery know more of the background here. But I'm wondering what you make of her strategy to maybe,
Yeah.
use the tone that she's using.
It did feel very argumentative, very contentious, very pointed, and even calling upon her. You're saying under oath. I mean, almost implying that you have to answer to God for this, which seemed a little bit almost like a veiled threat. I think maybe that's putting it a little bit harshly, but I wondered what are you trying to say there? What are you trying to imply? And I like to watch people.
I too,
right? Yeah. Watching people's reactions online, a couple of people were saying things, a lot of people saying, why is the judge letting her do this? Why is he letting her be so tense or so mean to this witness? And of course, we know the judge certainly has to keep order in the court, but also doesn't interject himself into each of the interactions, waits for the prosecutor to bring up those contentions. And they did. But I also wonder if it wasn't part of the strategy from the prosecutor to let some of this play out, because I wonder if they see that it's not helping her, and in fact, potentially may actually be doing more harm to her own case and her own credibility than it is to the prosecutor. What do you think about that?
I think you're onto something, absolutely, because it's almost like this might, and again, this is my personal opinion. I know we're journalists, but I would say it's almost like watching a train wreck, because you're, in speaking with other reporters who are in the courtroom, we're just kind of sitting there like, why is she doing this? Like, is this actually helping her case? Is this a defense strategy? It doesn't feel like it. It feels like like you said, it's almost like she's trying to get, kind of push back against this person that maybe was a friend at one point in time. And it seems like they were not even good friends. It felt like, according to testimony, more like loose acquaintances. But, and to say you're, this oath under God, it did feel like she was kind of trying to cast judgment a little bit and say, there's a greater power watching over this. So you better be honest here. And that's challenging. And when the prosecutor came back on redirect, she said, do you take oaths seriously, Ms. Sharp? It's almost interesting that that's a question, that's a follow-up question that has to be had, because it's just been some really interesting questions. And I don't think we would get that line of questioning had Lori Vallow Daybell continued using her public defenders. So it's really interesting to see. And quickly, I'll get to, kind of the jury's reaction to this. And I've been looking over at them, and no one's been like shocked. I haven't seen that, but they've been listening really intently. A lot of them are taking notes, and I would imagine that they're probably confused, because there's, a lot of these elements are, it feels a little insider baseball. Like, you had to know who these people are. And I know we've talked about Kay Woodcock, and we'll get into her coming up soon, but it feels like a lot of people testifying have mentioned Kay in one way or another. And I believe at one point, Lori asked Sarena, do you know Kay Woodcock? Have you talked to her? And it seems like she's almost digging for what records could you have? And she said no. But the jury doesn't have any idea who this person is. And we've been observing that Kay was in the courtroom. And Kay is Charles Vallow's sister, but also JJ Vallow's grandmother. And she was the first to sound the alarm way back in 2019 that her grandson JJ might be missing. So that she was, she and her husband Larry were really instrumental in this case in waving a flag. So of course we know who she is, but the jury doesn't at this point. But then this afternoon that changed, right, Andrea?
Right. She was on the stand, and this is where we have been waiting and wondering if she would take the stand and what kind of things they would ask her, because remember, she's the one who is the beneficiary of the life insurance policy that the prosecutor is going to argue is what motivated this killing, that money. Lori didn't know that she wasn't the beneficiary, or that had been changed. So, and yes, and Kay Woodcock has been very vocal, and we've seen her, of course, been very familiar with her and seen her throughout the case, and her husband, Larry, well known. They often are the ones that are doing interviews and really kind of rallying support. And you're right, they are the ones who really are the nexus for the beginning of this investigation into the Daybells. and really kind of began that whole thing that started all of these criminal charges. It was their alerting police that something's not right because we can't find
to
JJ,
start to really
right?
connect the dots. But and I know
she talked about JJ, and that's interesting,
she did.
right?
Yeah, she talked about JJ, and we can certainly unpack that, because we also don't know. We've heard JJ and Tylee, Lori's children, come up before. And that's another thing where you're thinking, is the jury picking up that there's a huge picture to the story that they're missing, that in some ways they can't hear in this courtroom, in this setting? But it makes you wonder if there's little snippets they're picking up on here, and if certain testimony might open a door into something bigger. And I feel like this was one of those moments where you could hear something bigger, because Kay takes the stand. We weren't sure if this was going to happen because she's been sitting in the courtroom listening, and usually if you're a witness that doesn't happen, but there are sometimes exclusions for family members. So we were kind of wondering and waiting what may happen here. And eventually she takes the stand. She's the last one on the stand this afternoon, and she walks through her relationship with her brother Charles, his marriage to Lori, and how this sort of evolved. And eventually around 2018, 2019, she said that she and her husband started to notice that something might be off. And then Charles came to her saying, we're having issues. He tried to serve divorce papers. Lori went missing somewhere. He didn't know where she was. Kay came to help with JJ. And it was just a really tense time for the family. And it's at that point in early 2019, I believe that around testimony said around February, March, April-ish, that's when they had that conversation, Kay and Charles, that Charles said he doesn't want to have Lori as his life insurance beneficiary anymore, and he wants to move it to Kay. So that's, a big part of this whole story here, because Lori allegedly was, killed Charles, not just to get him out of the way to be with Chad Daybell, but for his money too.
Right. And I think he had obviously started, I think we heard testimony from Adam about that, also testimony from Kay, just about how that relationship had devolved relatively quickly, and that Charles was sort of beside himself about what to do with it. He had learned about Chad Daybell, very, very difficult time. And really, you heard Kay Woodcock talk a lot about JJ and who is going to care for JJ and who is going to, when Charles is away, don't get a nanny, I'll take care of him. So that introduces this person, this child, to the jury. And I think she said during her testimony today, the last time I saw JJ, and she says when that was, which was years and years ago. So I believe that has to draw into question in a juror's
Unlock
mind.
Something in raise some flag for jurors that it's been years. And, we get through more of her testimony, and there's, she eventually gets up to the point where Charles is shot. She also did not learn from Lori that Charles, her husband, and Kay's brother had been shot. She learned from one of Charles's adult children at the time, called her and said, hey, what's going on? And she said when she tried to reach out to Lori, it was really hard to get a hold of her. She didn't even let JJ come to services back in his home, in Louisiana. So it just really is heartbreaking to hear this testimony again for us, because we know she's shared this similar story in interviews and other testimony in the cases in Idaho. And it's just, she got emotional on the stand when talking about this, because she's like, I had to alert my other siblings. It's just a horrible moment for this family, and to have to keep reliving it on the stand over and over. I can't even imagine what that must be like. But, you and I were texting through this, kind of being like, okay, this is the moment. And we both said, this is hard, but we're expecting Lori to cross-examine her. And that's going to be challenging too, because, it's interesting because Kay said on the stand that it wasn't always this way. She loved Lori. She said they didn't, keep in touch over the phone really, but when they were all together for family gatherings, she was chatty, she was outgoing, and they picked off no time had passed. And it's hard knowing what we know would ultimately happen, that Kay and her husband Larry are loving figures in this family. And have said multiple times they would have taken JJ. You know, they would have intervened if things had become too much. And that's ultimately not what happened. But we did get to see some tense moments between Lori and Kay. Take a listen.
Yeah.
And you weren't really aware of the events that happened that morning, were you?
The morning of his
July
murder?
Of July 11th?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
Because you didn't tell me.
Ms. Woodcock, did you see or hear or personally witness me conspire with Alex Cox to kill my husband, Charles Vallow?
No, but I saw a ton of evidence that did.
Thank you.
So on July 11th, when Charles Vallow was killed, did you actually have any idea that your brother was dead?
None at all. How would I know?
So in terms of you learning that your brother was dead, it was never from Lori
Or
Vallow.
from her.
It was,
It was from Google that my husband found.
thank you. I have no other questions.
Can you imagine learning that your sibling is dead from Google?
No.
What?
No, I can't, especially when there are people that could be telling you this, you know? And it's hard to even wrap your head around. And I want to get back to the jury because they're hearing this in real time. And it was interesting moments in the courtroom when you hear Kay answer the questions that Lori is asking her, but also add on her own statements there, being like, no, we heard that question again. Did you see or hear with your own eyes or own ears that, I conspired with Alex to kill Charles? And she said, no, but I've seen evidence that shows you did. So it really I thought her testimony really packed a punch. And one other thing that I want to point out, I think it was in the initial direct questioning, but there was a point where after Charles had passed and Kay was trying to, organize meeting with JJ, and she said on the stand that she didn't think JJ was safe with her, referring to Lori. And it sounded like she wanted to say more than that, but the prosecutor stopped her, cut her off. And I think that's one of those moments, like you described earlier, Andrea, that the jury must be picking up on that's
right.
That's a bigger issue here.
And the prosecutor being very, very careful not to let her go so far that there's an objection or that she does anything to introduce information that would ultimately cause her testimony to be not admissible. I think that was the concern there is, right? You can't answer questions that aren't asked. And so they have to be very specific about that. And I think because we did not see her continue down that line of questioning, that tells us we know there are motions in place. We know there have been hearings about what is going to be allowed to be discussed from Lori's previous criminal history. And so I think that prosecutor, that's what you saw there, is that her being very careful to not jeopardize this testimony from Kay Woodcock that was absolutely compelling. And I think to hear her talk about, I think that contempt, I think you saw that look on her face. Not only did she say those words to Lori, but I think there was a definite change in her demeanor in that moment. And I think it was, if that eye contact and the way that she spoke, I think that was very obvious. I think jurors probably picked up on that contempt.
And I'll add too that I was surprised Lori wasn't asking more questions of Kay. And I think we saw the change just seeing how she's addressed her brother and Sarena and, just some of the other questioning we've seen her exhibit in court so far. I was surprised it felt like she kind of stopped as soon as Kay said, well, you didn't tell me my brother was dead. And she realized, oh, this witness might not, I can't really compel her to say things in a way that makes me look favorable here. So let me ask my last, question.
Follow-up question,
thematic question of, were you in the room? Did you see it? Did you hear it? And that was the end of that. And I think it was because we saw some of that pushback from Kay in her testimony.
And I think it's notable I think Kay is so incredibly personable that I think that translates very well And you've heard her say on the stand before, I'm not a good liar, but there's something about her that's very endearing. And I think she's very relaxed. Her emotional testimony is not extreme. It just seems very genuine. And I think that matters. I think that's powerful in a testimony, in a trial like this, to see that, like you said, Lori wasn't super close with Adam. She wasn't super close with Sarena, but here, Kay herself is saying, absolutely. Like, we had this relationship. I liked her.
We were family.
I loved her. We were good. Exactly. And then to see that switch and to see her be just very real about that, I think that was probably the most powerful testimony we've seen so far in this trial.
Yeah. And I'll say she was the last witness of the day. And once she got off the stand, she went over, and the first person she came across was Colby, Lori's son, and they hugged. It was notable. I don't know. Obviously, the jury maybe doesn't know that significance,
right.
But I saw it and I was like, oh my gosh, it's heartbreaking. And we heard that echoed from Colby outside the courthouse. We were, outside, finishing our news gathering, and he came out, and we, were able to chat with him for just a few minutes. And, obviously he said this was hard to see not only his mom, represent herself in this way, his mom who is convicted of killing his other siblings. And he said it was really hard to see Kay's testimony because she has just been reliving this trauma over and over and over. And he said it's hard to see someone you care about go through that. And, it's interesting to see how some of these other family members who have been so negatively impacted by the actions of Lori and, and from her convictions in Idaho and the allegations here, that they've almost formed this bond.
Yes.
Because they've been wronged in such a horrible, horrible, horrible way. And, that's not something that, again, the jury uses in their deliberations. But I think they were, certainly, to your point, Andrea, certainly some powerful moments from Kay Woodcock's testimony and the aftermath of all of that.
And Colby this is his first day that he's been in the courtroom. And that makes me wonder, it would tell me that he may not be expected to testify, which I don't think would be shocking, just given his relationship. He didn't live in the house. He is Lori's son, but the oldest of them. And so he wasn't there, probably just doesn't have a lot to offer in this case, different than what we know in terms of the death of his siblings. He did have, he had conversations with his mom, tried to get her to explain what had happened. And so I think that was certainly very relevant in that case. So because he was in court today, that would indicate that he probably will not be called to testify. Of course, that could be an exemption that I'm not aware of. It's usually the immediate family members of a victim are usually the ones, because they do have a right essentially to represent that victim and to be there as a witness to what's happening in a trial. He wouldn't fall into that category. But I'm interested, did she ever acknowledge, Lori herself ever acknowledge Colby's existence? Did you ever see any interaction there that she knew he was in the courtroom?
I didn't pick up on anything, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And from what we understand, and, this was asked of Colby after court too, is for lack of a better term, has confronted his mother about this. We know that he's had communications with her since she's been extradited here to Arizona. She's been at the Andrea jail here in Phoenix. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, he, recorded his jail phone call with his mother and kind of put that out there on his own YouTube channel. And he said it's so important for him to have a platform like this to kind of put his narrative in all of this out there. And I know, as you said, Andrea, I think you're right on the money that it seems like we may not hear from him, in terms of testimony this time, but he's certainly been impacted by this case. And, Charles was a father figure to him. And I believe at the end of Chad Daybell's sentencing in Idaho, Fremont County, he said, I lost my, father, I lost my brother, I lost my sister. And in a way, he's lost his mother, because his mom is going to be incarcerated for the rest of his life, for the rest of her life. And I can't even imagine, the shoes that he's in right now. But no, from what I saw, he was in the front row, but not on Lori's side. So I'm not sure she would have a view seeing him in there if, she was looking that way when she walked in with the deputy. But it's also possible they she intentionally wasn't trying to look at him. I'm not sure. And that's just, I can't imagine that position in the courtroom.
No, but it does seem, as you said, it does seem that, that support that they've found in each other, and they've created a community through this tragedy. And so I'm sure that helped Kay to have him there, and it probably has empowered him in a lot of ways. And you're right, he has sort of claimed his voice. It's so sad to know that his biological dad no longer living. So that I know that he has talked about that as being just another tragedy. And of course, the deaths of JJ and Tylee, devastating for him. And so, difficult to put yourself in his shoes, but certainly interesting to see him in court. And it'll be interesting to see if he continues to come to trial, and we'll keep an eye on him and see if he adds anything, as we go through any of his, thoughts on the proceedings. Next week, do we know, this is the last day of the week, so we're not in court tomorrow. Do we know what's going to happen on Monday? We don't know what witness is going to be called next, do we?
No, we don't know what witness is going to be called next, but because they're not going in order of the witness list, and it seems like maybe they're skipping over some people. There were a ton of, officers, and we heard from two other witnesses today who didn't know Lori or Charles. It was, two expert types, a forensic analyst and someone who does data retrieval. So I think we're heading toward a path where we're going to see some of the contents of not only maybe Charles's phone, but maybe Lori's devices as well in all of this, and how that ties in. So I think we're going to start seeing some of those text messages, maybe between Lori and Alex, her brother, maybe Lori and Chad Daybell. We heard in opening statements that that's going to be coming out. And then I'm waiting to see, Andrea, we're waiting. There's this body camera footage, and it was from the Gilbert Police Department, which is an agency here in Arizona. And this would have been in early 2019 when, Charles and Lori were having these marital issues. And he actually called police at one point and said, she's lost her mind. I'm worried about myself. I'm worried about the kids. And we know that record exists. And we know that there are, investigators from Gilbert who are on that list. So I'm really waiting to see that come in, because to me, that just shows a living Charles Vallow clearly stating everything that the state is alleging Lori to have done, to have already done, and to do in the future, so it's from that time. So that's what I'm expecting that to maybe be coming up here. But we, again, just don't know when. The state's witness list is pretty long.
Well, and they are setting that foundation, as you said, some of the two witnesses today, basically giving just the sort of the lay of the land of how they collect evidence, fingerprint analysis, not really talking about specifics in this case, but just the nature of how they do that. So you're right. I would expect to start to see that and be able to prove that, yes, this is where that phone was. This is who made that call or who made that text. And you're right. Those videos that we expect to see, heartbreaking. Here's somebody essentially begging for help. And you talked about, needing to intervene and needing to essentially
and I don't
get
think
her.
Anyone could have imagined. I don't think anyone could have imagined from that moment in early 2019 how this entire case would have unfolded. But still, it's crushing. It's just crushing to know that he was trying. And we heard today he was trying with Lori's other brother. And it's a tough thing. And something we forgot to mention, but Kay was asked at one point too, was Charles ever, in fear? And she said Charles was in fear. And of course the line of questioning was very narrow, but I think the jury probably could pick up on that too. There's a lot of, reading between the lines a little bit, but I think, witness after witness, the more you hear little snippets of the bigger picture, I think there's going to be some takeaways there.
Yeah, I do too. And it's going to be, it'll be interesting to see. We, of course, we will be there, and you'll be inside the courtroom, and we will be here to bring you all of the latest and all of the analysis after that trial on Monday inside the courtroom. We hope that you will be here with us for that.
Thanks.